And he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. Preparing for today, forgot. I have to have my prison guard here. Okay. Preparing for this morning's service was a bit of a challenge because today's message, today's gospel reading, today's lessons are actually linked in a continuous narrative with tomorrow's lesson for Epiphany. So in other words, what's happening is everything between today and tomorrow is one flow of information. Now, I didn't want to do that because you have already suffered through some of my 40-minute sermons, and I didn't think you'd ever come back if I gave you another one. So I broke it up, and what I'm going to do is for today, I want to present context and background so that you can understand what is going on when we see the movements of Joseph and the family from Egypt, out of Egypt. What's being addressed, to what are we alluding, and not only that, but the significance of Christ being a Nazarene. If you've done any study, and if you've had any experience, you know that the issue of calling Jesus a Nazarene can become a bit daunting. But I'm not going to focus on the technical aspect. I just want to focus on the fact that we have Christ identified as a Nazarene. So, let's set up what we're going to discuss. As I mentioned, today's gospel is a continuous thought of the beginning of, it continues through the beginning of Matthew's gospel from chapter 1 till now. What we see are a number of factors addressed by Matthew. We see that there is the divine guidance of the Holy Family. We see that 3 times the angel of the Lord intervenes. One time we see an angel of the Lord presented, and then we just see one generic message, one generic inclusion of God leading the family. Also notice that there was no specific location given other than to tell Joseph, take your family back to Israel. Bethlehem wasn't identified. Nazareth wasn't identified. Just get out of town. Joseph chose Nazareth in which to live, and Luke tells us Jesus was born in Bethlehem. So we have 2 different towns right off the bat. So they returned, but not to his birthplace. And there's something else that needs to be discussed about the reference Nazarene. I'm going to mention it in just a second. And it has to do with the Old Testament. Now note, according to the prophets, and notice that Matthew says prophets plural. He doesn't identify one individual prophet or one individual text stating Jesus would be called a Nazarene. He refers to the body of the prophetic writing. But because he was the Messiah, that's why the phrase Nazarene is used. He came from an area of little repute, and pay close attention to the way that Matthew words Jesus' relation to Nazareth. He states, he shall be called a Nazarene. Now, why does he emphasize called rather than just say he will be a Nazarene? Because to call somebody a Nazarene is an insult. It was an offensive identification. Now, I'm not going to sit here and fill in the blank, but you can fill in any pejorative ethnic slur you would like when you are referring to the idea of calling somebody a Nazarene. And we've gone through an entire culture of this where people identify. I'm Italian, so I hear Dago Wop, I hear all of that stuff all the time. And that's nothing compared to what it meant to call somebody a Nazarene. Also, another thing to keep in mind as you read Matthew's presentation, whether correctly or not, they would have immediately seen the connections to the Mosaic experience. Pharaoh orders the execution of all children under 2. Herod orders the execution of all children under 2. Moses was sent away to a foreign land. He was put in the ark. Jesus was sent away to a foreign land. He was the true ark. Moses returns to Egypt at the death of Pharaoh. Jesus returns to Israel at the death of Herod. Now, there are, of course, obvious differences in the Mosaic and Jesus parallel. Pharaoh was the king of the Egyptians. Herod was, or claimed to be, the king of the Jews. Moses flees Egypt into Midian. Jesus, with the family, flees Judea into Egypt. The Mosaic story encompasses Moses' birth and life as a young man, whereas Jesus and the story related of his fleeing essentially remains as an infant account throughout Matthew chapter 2. Now, the first 2 differences may be deliberate contrasts with Moses, designed to draw attention to bad leadership in Judea at Jesus' time, and to the idea of Jerusalem as the place in which Jesus is rejected. Now, we can assume that Matthew's readers would have seen and read the echoes of the story of Moses in Matthew chapter 2. Not only does Matthew point his readers back to Moses, he also pointed them forward to Jesus' eventual passion and death. Look at the allusions to the passion narrative as they are sprinkled throughout Matthew chapter 2. Verse 2, verse 3, 4, verse 16, and verse 20. So Jesus' birth, unlike Moses', incorporates his death. From his birth, Jesus was linked to suffering and death. The holy innocents might seem out of place for the Christmas story, since we are still in Christmas time. For Matthew, though, it was an integral part of Jesus' infancy, again, implying Herod's influence in the relationship to what the family was doing. Now, we all have heard about Herod. And we may have heard some generic stuff about Herod. I'm going to introduce you a little bit to Herod, not completely, but I'm just going to give you a little insight as to who Herod was. Besides the slaughter of the innocents, he slaughtered the remaining members of the Hasmonean dynasty of the Jewish high priestly kings. He executed more than half the Sanhedrin. He killed 300 court officers simply because he wanted to. He placed a massive eagle on the arch leading into the temple, which the Jews viewed as blasphemy and created an uproar. 2 youths, I think of my cousin Vinny every time I say that because I can't get that out of my mind. I even break into 2 youths. 2 youths climbed up, and in broad daylight they chopped down that eagle. Everyone knew they were influenced by a group of very famous, very influential teachers, but because the teachers were popular and Herod was more concerned with his political rule than doing what was right, Herod had the 2 youths killed, and then he had 40 others burned alive. He executed his own wife. No cheers from the men in here. Mirame. He executed his mother, Alexandra. He executed his sons, Aristobulus, Alexander, and Antipater. Not not a candidate for Father of the Year or Husband of the Year. And for good measure, on his deathbed, he left an order for all of the notable men of Jerusalem to be assembled in the hippodrome and murdered as soon as his own death was announced. And the reason was simply because, according to Josephus, he didn't want the sound of wailing to be absent at his death, because he knew how much he was hated. So, if you have the majority of noblemen murdered on the day that you die, he knew there would be weeping and wailing in the streets. Fortunately, after his death, this final order was never carried out. That's just a thumbnail clip of who the man was. Now, I want to expand on one thing that I just previously mentioned, and that is the Hasmonean dynasty, because it actually moves us into one of the most amazing providential acts that you will see in history. The Hasmoneans, as you may remember or may not, they were the dining rulercy of Judea, Judea and the surrounding regions between 140 BC and 37 BC. So remember, when we talk about Herod, we're talking about the Old Testament time. We're talking about BC. Between 140 and 116, the dynasty, the Hasmoneans, ruled Judea semi-autonomously. They were within the Seleucid Empire. You remember Alexander the Great turned over his vast empire to his 4 generals. One of them was Seleucid. And from roughly 110 BC, the Hasmoneans ruled simultaneously with the Seleucids until that empire started to disintegrate. After the disintegration, they gained further autonomy and they expanded into the neighboring regions of Perea, Samaria, Idumea, Galilee, and Iturea. And this will become important in a second. The Hasmonean rulers took the Greek title Basileus, or king. And the kingdom attained regional power and status for several decades thereafter. But, as with every empire, there was a civil war in 63 BC. And what that did was that prompted the Roman general Pompey to intervene. He met with both the leaders of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and because the Pharisees seemed more conservative to the conservative Roman general, who was, for all intents and purposes, one of tradition, he gave them, Pharisees, the political power to run Palestine, and he turned Palestine into a client state. And it was here that Herod the Great displaced the last reigning Hasmonean client ruler in 37 BC. Now, why? Why do I mention that? Because by siding with the Pharisees, by having an internal civil war, by the Hasmoneans collapsing internally, they brought Pompey into the situation. They brought a Roman general to come in to quell the uprising. And Pompey had inadvertently allowed them to elevate Herod to the ruler of Palestine. So in turn, that meant upon his death, his son Archelaus would assume control in 4 BC. However, Archelaus was such a horrendous ruler, he even tried to out-Herod his father, and he did this by immediately executing 3,000 people upon taking control of the throne. Augustus had to step in, Augustus Caesar had to step in and remove him from office and disbanded the client king. And because of that, he installed throughout the entire region governors, one of whom was none other than Pontius Pilate. If they had been good rulers, there would have been no Roman intervention. If there had been no Roman intervention, there would have been no Pontius Pilate. If there had been no Pontius Pilate, there would have been no trial. There would have been no trial. There would have been no crucifixion, because the Jews were not authorized to execute. Herod's reign was so bad, it was so terrible, that it prompted Augustus to utter one of the most famous quotes in all of history. He said, "It is better to be Herod's pig than Herod's family." And no Jew missed the irony of that statement. On Herod's death, his kingdom was divided to his three sons, Herod Archelaus, who was the ethnarch, or the ruler of a specific ethnicity or region, Judea and Samaria; Herod Antipas, who was the tetrarch, he controlled the 10 regions in Galilee, and he was the Herod that we find in Matthew 14, when the adult Jesus is active in Galilee. And then there was the third son, Herod Philip, who we all know about Philip, and John the Baptist, and he will appear in Matthew 14, and he ruled the remaining regions. When this is understood, we see precisely why Nathan's response to Philip's suggestion of a Messiah from Nazareth was uttered. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Think about the worst region you can in Tennessee. Now, I'm not from Tennessee, so I can't name a community, thank goodness. I can name a few in California, however. The first one that comes to all of our minds immediately is Compton. Gang-related. There are murders as if they were scheduled. And it would be like saying, can anything good come out of Compton? Or Harlem in New York. Or Watts. Or any of the more familiar and famous places where we see disruption and anger and violence. Being called a Nazarene was the equivalent of being called the worst ethnic, the worst derogatory insult you can imagine. And if Nathanael, a native of Cana, only a few miles from Nazareth, reacted like that, imagine the general response in Judea, where most people probably never heard of Nazareth. On this understanding, it is not only the word which conveys Matthew's message. It's a Greek word, doesn't matter that you know it, it's just Nazareth. But it is also more specifically the word he shall be called, emphasizing the derogatory name calling. In Matthew 26:71, where we see the only other occurrence of that term in Matthew, the term is used in exactly that way by someone in Jerusalem. Matthew chapter 1 focused on the identity of Christ. It was the first answered question, who is Jesus? By relating him genealogically to Abraham and David. Then it showed how Joseph, the legal father of Jesus, and how he got the name Jesus. And then in Matthew chapter 2, the emphasis shifts from the identity of Jesus to a series of places associated with Jesus. So if the major concern of chapter 1 was the who, the major concern of chapter 2 is where. And all of that sets up tomorrow. The divine overshadowing of the birth narrative presents a stark contrast to the manner in which Jesus would be identified as exemplified in the prophets. And remember, in the Old Testament there was this thing called a Nazarite vow. We talked about that a couple weeks ago, where you would assume to take on responsibilities. The Nazarite vow generally was for the firstborn, and if you'll remember the Old Testament, Israel was required to give their firstborn to Yahweh as payment for what Yahweh did in the Exodus. And rather than take the firstborn of every mother in Israel, he took the Levites. And the Levites became the substitute for every firstborn in Israel. Who was Jesus? Jesus was the firstborn of the Father. He was the only child of the Father. But where does the connection come into the Levites? He was the final priest, was he not? After the order of Melchizedek. Jesus' birth, and tomorrow we will see his revelation to the rest of the world. Jesus' birth is the continued fulfillment of God's involvement in human history. The Messiah, the divine King of the Jews, would be known as Jesus of Nazareth, the crude ethnic insult meant to demean, to humiliate, to marginalize him in his ministry. Jesus of Nazareth, from a nowhere town of nowhere repute, with no apparent influence of any kind, was chosen by the triune Godhead to be the place where the Son of God would be raised as a man. Jesus of Nazareth, from this nothing place, would eventually be revealed to every place as the divine, final, eschatological prophet, priest, Lamb, Messiah, Adam, and King. It is in Jesus of Nazareth, from an insignificant town in a small, almost irrelevant Middle Eastern country, where the Savior of the world of all mankind would be revealed. Not to priests, not to prophets, not to scribes, not to Pharisees, not to lawyers, not to politicians, not to noblemen, not even to kings, but to lowly shepherds tending the sacrificial flock, and to Gentile wise men coming from the east tomorrow at Epiphany.